I was born in Bull Hill Hospital in Darwin in 1969. Darwin's a small town that neighbours Blackburn. My mum's from Blackburn, my dad's from Darwin. My dad worked in a mill in Darwin. We grew up in a two-bedroom terraced house which was near a park called Bullventure Park. So I spent a lot of my childhood growing up around Bullventure Park. I've got one older brother, he's 4 years older than me. My dad worked in a local mill. He basically, that was his entire work life. He left school, did an apprenticeship, did national service, and then went to work there, and he was qualified as an engraver. My mum worked on the market as a butcher when I was really young. Prior to that, she worked in a hat shop in Darwin when she was pregnant with me. Because my mum and dad worked a lot, I was kind of brought up by my older brother a lot of the time, and spent a lot of time in a house on Reservoir Street, at the top of Reservoir Street, which was my grandfather's house. And it was, I guess, very working class. You know, people said to me nowadays, you know, what was it like growing up? I say it was a bit like an episode of the Royal Family, but with less dialogue. And my granddad had been a bin man. He'd been unemployed for a number of years in the 30s, and he was a bin man. And then him and my grandmother would sit in kind of rocking chairs, and they had an outside toilet. So there was kind of a bucket in the corner where people would go to pee, and we'd eat Greggs pasties and drink lots of tea and watch Cracker Jack on telly. But you know, I don't have bad memories of my early childhood really. Played a lot of football, and yeah, my primary school was like 5 minutes away from my house. So like we would go to school in the morning, and then we would come home at dinner time to have our dinner. But like I said, I asked my dad about this a few years ago, and my mum and dad didn't really plan for me. And so I didn't see a lot of my dad when I was young, because he was always working overtime to pay for two kids. And then I guess as we were talking about fashion and culture, my first memory of fashion really would have been when I was around 12 years old, 11, 12 years old. There was a kid called Paul Ryder who we hung around with, and we always hung around in gangs of kids, and Paul Ryder had invited me to go to a local disco which was called Bogart's, and I turned up on his doorstep all excited to go. It was a Thursday evening, it was a sunny Thursday evening, and I was all excited to go to this disco, and he opened his front door and he looked me up and down and he said, "You can't come." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You're not coming out with me with them on." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "You've got flares on." He said, "You can't come out with me with them on." I said, "What are you talking?" And I was absolutely oblivious to what he was talking about, because my mum had dressed us through the 70s, and it had been, you know, but my mum dressed us pretty well, and you know, she got us, me and my brother would get Adidas Europa t-shirts and Fred Perry t-shirts, and in the late 70s I got my first pair of Adidas football boots, which were Adidas Beckenbauers, and I got my first pair of Adidas trainers, which were my first pair of branded trainers, which were Adidas Kick. But we just went out and played football. You know, we didn't care about clothes or think about clothes or any of that stuff. I remember getting my first football kit. It was an Admiral England kit, and it was super itchy and uncomfortable. And then a couple of years later, my dad was a big fan of Brian Clough's, and they got us Nottingham Forest kits, which were, they had to get mail order, and they were Adidas kits. And I remember the difference in the quality and of the fabrics they used. And me and my brother both had these Nottingham Forest kits, and they had like, the branding on them was in flock, and I still love flock to this day, and I've used flock in the Adidas Spezial range that I designed. My brother got his nicked at school. They were the first kind of branded goods that I remember. But like I said, I've gone to Paul Ryder's house, and he said I can't go to Bogart's because I'm wearing flares. Tells me to go home and get my jeans tucked in by my mum. So I go home and I say, "Mum, I need my jeans taken in." She's like, "What are you talking about?" I was like, "I need my jeans taken in or I can't go to Bogart's." And she's like, "I don't have a sewing machine, and if I did, I wouldn't know how to do that anyway." So it was like Cinderella didn't go to the ball, you know. I kind of end up sat watching Top of the Pops with my mum and dad and didn't go there. And I remember that, and I think that, I always say that was kind of year zero for me with fashion, because I thought from there on it's like there's no way I'm not being able to go with my mates to do stuff. And football was a big thing in our house. My dad was a Blackburn Rovers fan. You know, when my mum was working on the markets on Saturday, from a really early age, I remember we'd go to watch Blackburn Rovers, and I was so small that I'd have to take the washing up bowl out of the sink and carry that with me on the bus down to Ewood Park, and we'd sit in the Fairnurse pub across from Ewood Park while my dad had a drink, and I'd be holding this washing up bowl, and then we'd go into the ground, and I would have to put the washing up bowl by the wall and stand on top of it on tiptoes just to be able to see over the wall. And it was terracing then, and you know, and it rains a lot where I come from, so I kind of, it would be like the longest 90 minutes of my life when I would go to football, because I would be freezing cold in sort of duffel coat trying to look over the wall to see Blackburn, who were at the time at the bottom of the second division. But football, you know, for me growing up, music, clothes and football were kind of everything really, you know. And yeah, I started to get into clothes. When I first got into clothes, we were all wearing skin tight jeans, white socks, Adidas trainers, Fred Perry t-shirts, Slazenger sweaters, loads of burgundy, tank tops were big. We'd buy stuff off the market, so it'd be, first it was tank tops with Fred Perry t-shirts under it, and then it was, I remember there was a period where it was like Yale cardigans, and then it was, and you know, and we'd wear anoraks because it rained a lot and it was practical, so it was Adidas anoraks. And then not long after that there was a big thing for Patrick Cagoule, and this was in my kind of early teenage years. And you know, the fashion we were into, it wasn't really brand led initially, but then it began to kind of pick up momentum. And you know, we weren't reading magazines, there wasn't any internet, it was just observing what was going on around you in the kind of youth clubs, and on just, you know, hanging around street corners basically. Next thing, it was Pringle and Lyle and Scott, and it was these kind of Ronnie Corbett style golf sweaters. And then, you know, there was like an older group of lads that we looked up to. They called themselves the Darwin Night Patrol, and they were, you know, they would go to Manchester United games, some of them, and they would come back and be like, you know, I remember once we were all in a working men's club that we used to go to on a Friday night, and I remember them all walking in wearing flared cords, like tight at the top and then flared at the bottom. This would have been about 1983, I guess. But you know, and with like, you know, with tracksuit tops and trainers. But I remember kind of, you know, we'd all been wearing skin tight jeans, and they all walked in with bell bottoms on, and you were like, what are they doing? Because like flares were like the most unfashionable, untrendy. They were the thing that your uncle had worn in the 70s. It's like, and it was like, within a very short space of time, we were all wearing flares as well. And it was like true street fashion, I guess. And we, you know, it went from Pringle and Lyle and Scott, V-neck sweaters. It then went on to, I remember going to a family party, and my cousin, who was a little bit older, was wearing this V-neck sweater with a crocodile on the chest. I remember a Lyle and Scott, a Pringle sweater, a plain V-neck one was $19.99, a diamond one was about $28.99. And he had this sweater on, and it was a plain acrylic sweater with a crocodile on. And he was like, you know, you need to get one of these. And he was like, 40 quid. I was like, 40 quid? He said, is it lamb's wool? He's like, no. I was like, what, 40 quid for an acrylic sweater? And sure enough, you know, in a very short space of time, we were wearing Lacoste as well. And it moved away from, you know, we'd been buying stuff that was kind of like golf fashion in a way, and then it moved into sportswear. And how we afforded that sportswear at that time, I've no idea, because I remember in like 83, you go to Manchester, and you know, going into Manchester shopping was like running the gauntlet. You had to be mindful of what you were going to go, where to go shopping, because there were kids in the Orndale Centre, and if you were kind of wearing an expensive tracksuit, you were likely to be followed out of the Orndale Centre and robbed. We used to call it taxing back then. And there was shops in the Orndale Centre like Gans Gear and JD Sports, and they would, you know, like a Tashini tracksuit, Sergio Tashini or a Fila tracksuit, you were paying upwards of 70 quid for a full tracksuit. This is in 1983. So these European sportswear labels were incredibly, you know, they were aspirational, and you associated them with affluence. It wasn't this idea that, oh, you're wearing sportswear, you're a chav. It was a symbol of aspiration, and so, you know, we got into that stuff, and around that time it was like European sportswear brands remained popular right the way through the 80s. As the fashions changed, and they changed very quickly, Adidas somehow, you know, they were constantly bringing out new ranges, and somehow those ranges were always the right thing at the right time. It was kind of, you know, we were buying sportswear a lot of the time from shops that were run by kind of ex-professional sportsmen who were selling cricket bats and tennis rackets, and it, you know, it wasn't pre-packaged, it was something we were adopting. And a lot of the fashions that we adopted were, you know, they weren't meant for us. So when we were going to Greenwoods and buying Pierre Sangan sweaters, they were stuff that sort of businessmen wore. They weren't for sort of like snotty 14-year-old kids from council estates and terraced houses, you know. And so when the sportswear thing came along, I remember one night going to the corner shop, and as I got there I could hear this music, and I'd never heard anything like it, this kind of electronic music, and I saw a group of these older lads who were kind of part of that group. I don't know the exact chronology, whether this was prior to them calling themselves a Darwin Night Patrol or around the same time, but they had kind of a big piece of linoleum and a portable, like a ghetto blaster, and they were playing electro, and I'd never heard anything like it, and they were breakdancing, and I was like, what is this, you know? And I stood there, and I was just like, it was like this spectacle really, and I thought, you know, this is interesting. And I asked them what the music was, and it was a Street Sounds compilation, and I immediately went to a record shop that weekend and bought a Street Sounds compilation. I think the first Street Sounds compilation I bought was Electro 3. And then I got into breakdancing, and I had like a little gang of mates. You know, the other thing that in my area growing up, there was a lot of racism. There was a lot of violence, and there was a lot of racism, particularly in Blackburn. My godfather was Jamaican, and he had a sweet shop in a village nearby called Oswaldtwistle, and he was like the only Jamaican in Oswaldtwistle, and him and my dad had bonded over cricket, the love of cricket, and so he was my godfather, and he was my favourite godfather as well. And then there was these three brothers. Their dad had gone back to Africa, and their mum couldn't look after them. They'd grown up in Manchester, and they'd been adopted by a white family in Darwin, and I became very friendly with them, and we used to do newspaper rounds together and stuff, and then there was another mate of mine who was an Asian kid who lived in the corner shop, and there was like this little gang of us, and we were mixed. And the racist thing, like there were like every area of Blackburn had its own kind of gang, and all these gangs, that the one thing they all had in common was they hated people from Darwin. And there was a lot of racism, and so we used to go to Manchester every weekend, and we used to go to an estate in Manchester called Hume, and my friend's mum, she lived in Epping Walk in Hume, so we'd go there on a Saturday, and we'd have, you know, chicken, rice and peas, and spend the afternoon there. And so, coming from this very white working class background, I was exposed to other cultures at quite an early age, and I was quite interested and by that stuff, and you know, and so where I'd grown up going to watch Blackburn Rovers, football hooliganism had started to become really popular, and these gangs would, you know, when it came to weekends, they would basically team up to go to football matches, and because there was so much animosity between Blackburn and Darwin, we would go in the opposite direction. So we would go to Bolton, to Manchester, to Bury, and we would go to these kind of soul discos really, and they would play 80s soul, and then there'd be like a period of like half an hour where they would play electro and stuff that we would breakdance to, and we were really committed to what we were doing, and so we would practice for hours and hours and hours, and then initially we would go into Blackburn and dance in the shopping centre down there, but then, like I said, we were way better than everybody in Blackburn, and so we started to go further afield. So then we went to Bolton, and then before we knew it, we were kind of like the number one crew in Bolton, and then we won the Lancashire Championships, and then we were going to Manchester, and we started to go. First time I went to a club in Manchester that was like a dedicated hip-hop club. It was a club called a Satellite Club in Cheetham Hill on a Sunday afternoon, and it was like Moss Side and Cheetham Hill would dance against each other, and because my mate's mum lived in Hume, we danced with Moss Side against Cheetham Hill, and it was just a very kind of exciting time. And the thing was, we were watching videos of American kids, but the stuff that they were wearing wasn't available to us. So what you would have was, you'd have this like improvised look where, like, something like the Adidas Superstar, the Shell Toe, which is synonymous with hip hop culture. I didn't see a pair of those in the flesh until about 1989. So our Superstar was the Adidas Gazelle, but that was also a shoe that a lot of football casuals wore. Scallies, casuals, lads, dressers, whatever you want to call them. And so there was this kind of crossover with fashion. And the other thing was, I remember, like, fashion would just evolve so fast for us. Another story I've told before, but you know, I remember going on holiday to Spain with my mum and dad, and it was always exciting to go to Spain because you knew you would see really good Lacoste products in Spain. And I remember going to Spain and getting this Lacoste tracksuit, and I was so excited about it because it had this really big crocodile on it. And I thought, I'm going to impress the older lads when I get back. And I remember kind of getting back and going over to Bolventure Park, and I was waiting in the park, sat there with my Lacoste tracksuit and my suntan, and like 3 or 4 of the older lads came walking in, and they were wearing like Burberry jackets, aquascutum jackets, deerstalkers, walking sticks with, like, you know, flares and Adidas trainers, and it was like, I'm stood there in my tracksuit and they're like, "Oh mate, it's all moved on." You know, but the thing about it is, I've been on holiday for 2 weeks, you know, so it changed so fast, and it was like, and you kind of had to be abreast of the changes. So where we wore tracksuits because we were breakdancers, you know, it was like we also would, you know, wear other stuff with that, and it was like, say, it was this like improvised version of what Americans were wearing, but it was kind of like, it was a whole weird mixture of like European sportswear, CNA ski wear, kind of Luta ski jackets. You know, if you look at a lot of the UK hip hop stuff from that era, you know, whether it be sort of Nelly Hooper wearing, you know, Vivienne Westwood alongside sportswear, it was like the UK had, you know, it was taking a culture that wasn't ours and putting our own kind of spin on it. So we became pretty good at dancing, and then we started to travel. You know, we came down to London to Freestyle 85. I remember going out, the best crew in Manchester, the best crew in the UK in 1985 were a crew called Street Machine, and there was a club on a Sunday afternoon which was next door to the Manchester Apollo, the concert venue. It was called the Apollo Bistro, and they would have £30 prize money. And Street Machine had that guy who was in Take That, Jason Orange, he was a member of Street Machine, and so we used to dance against Street Machine every Sunday, but they were slightly older than us and they were better than us in truth. So when we would travel out of Manchester, remember we went to Sheffield, to a club called The Limit in Sheffield, and it was like, the 2 crews from Sheffield were Steel City Breakers, who were like our age, and then there was Smack 19, who were the older crew. So it was like we danced against Steel City Breakers, and then Street Machine danced against Smack 19. But like I say, Street Machine were far and away the best, by 1985, the best crew in the UK, and I don't think they get given enough credit for that. But then 1986, it's like the bottom just fell out of the whole breakdancing thing. It was like you would train all week, you'd go to a nightclub, and then you'd start to dance. People were like, "What are you doing that for? It's over, it's out, it's finished." And at that point, that was when I started to go to more football matches, and There was a couple of years where it was a very weird time, from like 86 to 88, where people were wearing, like, I call it like the Luther Vandross era. Do you know what I mean? So people would be like going out to, like, you know, going out underage drinking to clubs with like chinos and ties, and there was like, you know, Levi 501 advert came out with Nick Cayman in it, and there was like, you know, all this talk about Italian panineros, and you know, and it, you know, I think it was the first time I probably saw a fashion magazine. I remember seeing Arena around that time, and Paul Smith and Tag Heuer watches, and Mickey Rourke in 9.5 Weeks, and it was this kind of like really odd time, really, you know, like kind of Rick Astley fashion, and people wearing ties and jeans and ties with jeans, and it was just a really weird time. But there was kind of alongside that where it had gone to sort of, from sportswear, it had gone to this kind of like Burberry and Aquascutum, and it had then moved on from that, and it had gone into sort of, Armani was like amazing at that time, and I loved Armani because it you know, the logo had the same initials as mine, so I was kind of obsessed with Armani. And there's only one Armani stockist in Blackburn, and we used to go in to look at their Armani, and they hated us. It was a shop called Wardrobe, and you would turn up there and they had like a log fire, and they were hoping to sell kind of expensive knitwear to businessmen, and like a gang of us would turn up just kind of saying, well, you know, can we see your Armani stuff? And you could just get the kind of sighs and the rolling eyes while we were kind of thumbing through these clothes. And there was a big subculture in Blackburn where a lot of guys who were older than us were going to Europe and basically stealing designer clothing and bringing it back, and also stealing sportswear, and particularly adidas trainers. And you know, the whole thing about casual fashion, people always talk about casual fashion, they talk about football casuals. Some of the best dressed casuals I knew from Blackburn didn't even go to football matches. You know, they were quite sophisticated in that they were pretty well read, they were politicised, they had good record collections, they were on the wrong side of the law, but they were very low key about it. You didn't know what they were doing or where they were getting the money from. And I've said this before, you know, I think that like the casual culture of the 80s gets misinterpreted because of the lad culture of the 90s, because lad culture in the 90s basically borrowed, it was like class tourism, it took things from the 80s, like football, yeah, we all love footy, we all drink beer, you know, we read lad mags, it's like, but it didn't have the intelligence of casual. And so there was like, you know, there were guys who were older than us who were coming back with they just had amazing wardrobes, you know, and so whilst there was all that Luther Vandross thing going on, you'd also had this thing of like, you know, you had Armani, but then you had all these European casual wear labels. You know, that was around 1985 really, where things like Chow, Pop 84, Ball, Replay, Martin's Evolution, and then it went, you know, there was this mad thing that then happened in Blackburn particularly, which was Iceberg. They started to come back with all this Iceberg clothing because, and the reason they would nick Iceberg is because it was so expensive. And it was this really expensive knitwear. So you would see these gangs of lads from Blackburn with like, you know, just covered in cartoon characters, you know, like, and this was like, you know, what, 5-6 years before anyone from, before UK Garage even existed, you know, and I know that Iceberg gets associated with that, but it was like a real Blackburn thing. And a lot of the fashion, I guess, at the time was dictated to us by what was available. So it's just a really exciting time looking back on it, but at the same time, it was a really boring time. And I think that, you know, nowadays, like fashion is obsessed by kind of youth cults and youth culture. But all those great youth cultures were born out of boredom. You know, in the early 80s, we had 3 TV channels. They closed down at 12 o'clock, so you didn't have any telly then until sort of like probably 9 o'clock the next morning. In the morning, it'd be programmes for schools and colleges or whatever. You know, we didn't, in my house, we didn't have a video recorder, we didn't have a telephone, we didn't have a car, we didn't have central heating. You know, it was like, you know, because there was so little entertainment provided, we kind of made our own entertainment, and all that violence thing that was going on with gangs, it was basically young youths who were basically bored, looking for something to do, and that was the way that they made their own kind of entertainment. And I guess what happened was, come 1988, it was just quashed overnight, literally overnight. So you had like all these different areas of Blackburn. So you had Blackburn youth were like the main crew of Blackburn, if you will, or known as the main crew of Blackburn, main football crew of Blackburn. But there was like, you know, like Mill Hill and Blackburn youth would fight with each other all week and then go to football and kind of unite against people from other towns. But like you had all these different areas. So you had like, you know, you had like the Wimberley Boot Boys, the Highcroft Demolition Squad, you had the ICU, the Intensive Care Unit, who were all around the infirmary in Blackburn. You had Little Harwood that became Blackburn Youth, you had Mill Hill State 4, you had Daisyfield Riot Squad, and you know, we called ourselves the Darwin Casuals, but part of the thing of calling ourselves, it was we kind of didn't like the fact that all these gangs from Blackburn would kind of, you would see Blackburn Youth, New Order, NF on every bus shelter in Blackburn, and you know, people would write graffiti on the backs of the buses, but not kind of New York style graffiti, just write their names, do you know what I mean, and bands they were into. And the music that people listened to through the 80s, it was kind of like, Factory Records had like a cult following in Blackburn, New Order particularly. You know, I remember when I was really young going to watch Blackburn Rovers, and on the bridge before you got to Ewood Park, it had Joy Division. And I thought it was something to, I thought it was like, you know, because you had the first division, the second division, the third division. I thought, you know, what's the Joy Division? I thought it must be something to do with football, you know, but like you saw that daubed on the walls of Blackburn everywhere, you know, and so it was like factory bands like A Certain Ratio, Stockholm Monsters, but then people were also into like Big Audio Dynamite were really big, Talking Heads were really big, Lloyd Cole and the Commotions were really big, bizarrely, and it was like, but there were like these certain bands that people were really kind of into, but especially New Order. And you know, I remember going to see New Order in 1989, and Bernard dedicated one of the songs to the Blackburn youth. And but so you had all these different areas and all these different gangs, and like I say, so people would like write stuff on the backs of buses, and that would the trouble would come from stuff that was being written on the buses. So friends of mine would write Darwin Casuals on the buses, and before you knew it, like, you know, it was kind of antagonising these kids from Blackburn who would come up, like literally hundreds of them, looking for trouble. And then all of a sudden, September 1988, it stopped, and it stopped overnight, and it stopped because of acid house. And I remember going in September 1988 to a club in Blackburn called Celavese, and it was on a Thursday night. And I walked in there, and it was slightly uncomfortable because you had all these kids from all different areas of Blackburn and Darwin all under the same roof. And there was this kind of, you know, like sirens and acid sounds and Chicago house music, and people were waving their arms about, and bandanas and oversized t-shirts, and it was like, what, like, it was slightly uncomfortable because you were thinking, there's no trouble. Like, when's it going to go off? Because it was almost like a fixture of the night. If you went to a disco, that there would be a fight at some point in the night where, you know, the music would stop, and it was like, it was over. It was like ceasefire, amnesty, done. I was unemployed for about, I don't know, 8-9 months or something, and then my mum basically said, if you don't do something with yourself, you're out on your ear. And the thing I was good at school was art, so I went to art college in Blackburn, and this was when all the trouble was still going on, and so I used to have eyes in the back of my head when I was going to college, to art college. But I didn't really take college that seriously, and towards the end of the year I was having a fling with a girl who was doing textiles, and she basically said to me, we had to apply for degrees, and she said not many men apply to do fashion, so if you apply for a fashion course you'll probably get on a degree, because I was thinking I've got to get onto another course because otherwise I'm just going to go back to signing on. So I looked around and I discovered that Manchester Poly was not a very good fashion course at the time. It was one of the worst in the country apparently. So I put Manchester Polytechnic as my first choice and applied to get on a degree. And we used to get these interrail tickets where you could travel around Europe for a month for free, and we would travel about. And I basically, when I was signing on, I used to help out a guy with some painting and decorating. I used to sort of sand the door frames for him and just do all the dog's body jobs. And he basically said, if you come and help me out, I'll pay for you an interrail ticket basically. So he took me interrail, and he was quite a bit older than me, this guy. And there's a little gang of them who from my hometown. It's a bit of a mad story, but they were like the hardest lads in town. They were older than my older brother, and a group of them got into they became born again Christians. So he thought, I think his idea was, well, if you come on interrailing with us, we'll convert you to Christianity, and it basically backfired on him massively. And by the end of the holiday, his Christian values were massively tested by me, and he couldn't wait to see the back of me, I think. And so we did this interrailing, and so I'd been to Paris and I'd been to Milan, and so when I went for my interview for this fashion course in Manchester, I bought myself a new rig out and went in there spouting off about how I'd spent time in Paris and Milan, and they gave me a place on this degree. So I moved to Manchester August 88, and I got a part-time job in a clothes shop called Coral Twig, and I worked in this clothes shop with two girls. One was called Fiona Allen and the other one was Rebecca, and they both worked for the Hacienda. And Fiona Allen's now a comedian. She did a TV show called Smack the Pony, and she used to be on the door of the Hacienda. And so I was always good for getting in, and the Hacienda, they used to have a woman stood on the door called Jasmine, who had like a really severe bob, and she'd stand there with the security guys and kind of curate the club really. So if you turned up and you looked like a bit of a Kevin and you had slip-on shoes and a shiny shirt, she'd turn you away. If you turned up and you had kind of a bob hairstyle and a hooded top and painter's jeans and a pair of trainers, you'd be in. And so I started to go to Hacienda every Wednesday and Friday, and then I would go back to Blackburn at weekends. But the first Blackburn Acid House night was at Celavese, and I'd been sort of exposed to it in Manchester, and then we put our first one on in Blackburn. And it was like under the balcony in the Hacienda, the first corner, which became notoriously known as Salford Corner, you'd have people like Sean Ryder from the Happy Mondays and Andy Rourke from the Smiths, and those sat amongst a lot of kind of faces from Manchester, and I used to see the Happy Mondays around quite a lot, and their kind of entourage were like, they had a lot of like older kind of scallies around them, but very smart, very sharp, very on it. And the next kind of section under the balcony became the Blackburn section, and because I was living in Manchester and I knew the people who were working at the Hacienda, people from Blackburn who were worried they'd travel 25 miles and might not get into the club would kind of want me to go into the club with them to make sure that they got in. And so a lot of these kids that we'd had trouble with years earlier, it's like I said, there was this like amnesty, and Blackburn it went from the first night at Celavese with 30 of us at someone's house afterwards, partying all night. So I watched it go from that in September 88. By the end of beginning of 1990, I guess, it was like 10,000 of us in a warehouse with riot police outside. But what I loved about the Blackburn parties was when it first started, there was coming from this horrendous, racist, violent sort of those years, you had this complete turnaround. we kind of believed we were going to change the world. Everyone was kind of growing their hair, giving up their jobs, dropping out of college. I dropped out of college after sort of 6 months and got a pass on extenuating circumstances. But it was, and you know, I didn't go back to college until 1994 after that. But it was like, it was parties for the people, by the people, parties without profit. That was the whole premise of what we were doing. We wanted to show that this was not about money. We didn't want what we'd had previous to that. The early Blackburn parties, they gave any additional money would be given back to the community. So these kind of scallywags, criminals, whatever you want to call them, had sort of all of a sudden become incredibly philanthropic. And I think that's beautiful, you know. And there was one of the early parties where on the poster said, "It ain't about that, it's about this," which is a lyric from one of the records he used to play. And it was a picture of a cheque where they'd paid for riding lessons for the kids of Blackamoor Special School in Blackburn. And I remember Blackamoor Special School, the headmaster sort of refused to accept the money. Which was sad, really. But what it also taught me, what I also got from Acid House, was I saw firsthand how the media is manipulative and basically just tell outright lies. And so, you know, I remember one week being at a party, and the week after on the Monday in the Evening Telegraph, it was like talking about occult rituals with 14-year-old girls at Acid House party. You know, and the week after, it's like the attendance went up by about 30%. Do you know what I mean? And so there was quite a small group of people at that time. Everybody knew each other, and there was like an unspoken code of conduct amongst everyone, which was, if you're in here doing this, listening to this music with us, you must be all right. And it was very communal, and people didn't rip people off, and people didn't break into people's cars, and it was like, there was like a mutual respect amongst everybody. But what happened with Acid House was, as it grew, lots of people started to appear, kind of lots of tourists came along who didn't understand that unspoken code of conduct. And what happened slowly and progressively over time was all the things that Acid House had initially rejected, it's you know, like, it started to become. So, you know, like, I witnessed how the media lied, but I also witnessed how money ruins things, and it was ruined from the inside as much as it was from the outside. People got greedy. Gangsters from other parts, like from Manchester, started to come over to Blackburn demanding the door money, and it just got ugly, really. And by 1990, for me, it was kind of over. By, you know, the end of '89, it was over, really. You know, because in '89 there'd been attempts to do legal parties, and no matter what efforts were made by the people that were organising the parties in Blackburn, it was never going to happen, you know. And there was, you know, looking back on it, I think that it felt like they were trying to stop something, because it brought people together and it unified people, and it unified lots of young people, and it was a very powerful thing because it wasn't politicised either. You know, on a Saturday night outside the set end, there would be a convoy of cars, and it would be like, you know, hundreds of cars would drive in a convoy through Blackburn to a warehouse. And the thing is, they didn't know where the parties were going to happen from one week to the next, because you'd had the recession of the 80s, and all these mills and factories and warehouses were sitting empty in Blackburn. So there was one particular guy called Tony Creft, who was like an industrial burglar, and he was basically a genius at getting into warehouses, finding PowerPoints, and basically getting these things off the ground. You know, this convoy of cars would just drag, like police would, I remember, you know, the police would try and stop the convoy. They would turn the police cars over, because some of these kids were, you know, who were doing this, they were, you know, they were ex-troublemakers, and all of a sudden, the ex-football hooligans, and all of a sudden it's like, no, we're partying, but, you know, get in our way and you'll see another side of us, kind of thing. And it was just an amazing thing. It's the only thing of any cultural significance, really, when you talk about pop culture that's happened in Blackburn, you know. And I'm kind of proud to have been a part of that, really. And you know, and it wasn't fashion led. You know, we were all still into clothes, but it was just great, really. It influenced my political views. It's influenced my view of the world. But you know, like I ended up, the early 90s were the worst time of my life. 90, 91, 92, terrible, terrible years, you know, because I saw this thing that had been a really beautiful thing kind of turned. It's almost a bit like when you know, I've read stuff about the late 60s and you had the hippie dream, and then in the early 70s it all turned ugly, you know, and the early 90s there was a terrible drug problem in Blackburn with, like, you know, heroin became really popular and crack cocaine and you know, and a lot of the people that had been thugs and troublemakers kind of went back to being thugs and troublemakers, sadly. And I, you know, and a few people went to prison, and it just, you know, it was just a horrible time to have that optimism in the late 80s to then for that to happen in the early 90s. But then by 94 I reapplied to college, and I went back to college and I studied fashion promotion in Preston. What I've done in my career at Adidas has been informed by what I did prior to education. All education really did. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking education. It was a good thing for me to do, but what it actually did was it validated me to what is a big corporate company. It validated my skills, but most of my expertise and knowledge comes from, it's more instinctive really. A lot of it, I don't think you can really teach, because it was born out of experience really, and like I say, a lot of my knowledge with Adidas, you know, Adidas is one of the only brands that throughout the way that brands were picked up and discarded at such a fast rate through the 80s by that kind of subculture that I grew up around, Adidas was one of the ones that kind of consistently remained. And you know, they wouldn't have been aware of it at the time, but it was just, they were just kind of almost like lucky coincidence. So, you know, like it had gone from brightly coloured suede shoes like the, you know, Dublins and Stockholms, but then it was like tennis shoes, and then from tennis shoes it was kind of, there were also Adidas leisure shoes, which were kind of almost like geography teacher style, like route shoes, if you will. And then mid-80s, like running shoes became popular, and you had the first Adidas ZX series, which was a massive thing where I was growing up. And you even had a gang of kids who knocked around Blackburn who called themselves the ZXZ, which kind of was born out of Adidas ZX. And then the second ZX series used a technology called torsion, but we loved the second ZX series because of the colours they used. Because the second ZX series happened to come out in 1988, and bizarrely they happened to be in these kind of peppermint and bright kind of pastel colours. You know, I remember I had a pair of ZX 5020s, which were the girls' ones, but the reason I had them is because they were like silvery grey with light blue and baby pink stripes. Anything baby pink in the 80s was good by me. So I guess my connection to the North has played such an important role throughout my career at Adidas. You know, it's almost like, you know, all roads lead back to the North. The handball Special was the shoe that basically I took the name for the Adidas range that I now design from. Special was a name that they would use for specialist sports shoes in the late 70s and early 80s. And I wanted a name for the range that was a German word that was easily understandable in English. And you know, I kicked around a couple of ideas, but we ended up with Special. And the thing about the handball Special was it sort of sums up the philosophy behind the range that I do, in so much as those shoes appeared in, I remember seeing them in Gibson Sports in Blackburn in about 1983, and they were bright blue with white stripes and a gum sole on them. But they were designed for a specialist sport, handball. I don't know anybody from Blackburn who played handball, not a single person, and yet that shoe was like picked up and adopted and became incredibly, incredibly popular. So this idea that a shoe that was a specialist sports shoe designed for German handball players was adopted by kind of, you know, working class kids on the streets of Blackburn and on the streets of Manchester, to me is what the essence of what Adidas actually means to me. It's this idea of taking something and changing the context of it, and the whole thing about casual culture and casual fashion is about taking things and changing the context of them. So, you know, it's, whether that be seeing, you know, I never forget walking through the Manchester Arndale Centre and seeing two black kids who were head to toe in Burberry. One of them was wearing Burberry check trousers with a Burberry jacket with a collar up and a Burberry rain hat, and it was like, you know, and his mate had kind of a shaved head and a big earring, and he was, you know, he was covered in, dripping in Burberry check as well, and it was kind of this idea of like, you know, the context of clothes, the thing that clothes, like people wearing clothes that they're not kind of meant for really. You know, there's something about that casual fashion where there's like something that's ultra conservative about it, but at the same time there's something that's just slightly off about it. So it's kind of, it's almost like with Spezial, it's like it's come full circle, this thing that doesn't really belong to anybody. Some people think they have ownership of it, but it doesn't belong to anybody. But a lot of people have a strong emotional attachment to it because it's something that they grew up through and have a connection to. That style that came from the North and still exists in the North, it's really difficult to emulate as well because, you know, like, because the fashions would change so fast, it's like it didn't travel. And so, like, you know, like if you think about a punk or a skinhead, there's like a defining look, you know, whether that be kind of bondage trousers or, you know, spiky hair or Doc Marten boots and braces and like, you know, an MA1 jacket. There's like a defining look. There's a defining look for mod. But with casual, it was just constantly changing so quickly that there wasn't a defining look to it. And what's happened now with the rise of the internet is now you're getting casuals in other parts of the world. How this thing from like, you know, gangs of kids who grew up in terraced houses in the rainy northwest of England has kind of travelled beyond that is pretty bizarre.